Thank you for tuning into Exposure. I'm Jill Hunkler and excited to have Sean O'Leary from the Ohio River Valley Institute joining us today.
And I'm Stuart Day, and I'm excited for this episode because Sean is going to be walking us through some of the incredible research that he and his team have done on the failed economic promises of the oil and gas and petrochemical industries in the Ohio Valley region.
And he was born and raised here, so he has some cred, Yeah.
So thanks again, Sean, and everyone for tuning in.
I'm Sean O'Leary. I'm a senior researcher at the Ohio River Valley Institute, which we affectionately know as ORVI. ORVI was formed about 4 years ago, well, almost 4.5 years ago now, specifically because so often debates about economic development in the region and particularly quality of life issues having to do with not just climate change, but local pollution and other issues had kind of deteriorated into jobs versus the environment frame. And we knew that there are lots of economic factors and issues, particularly with respect to the notion of economic development based on fossil fuel industries that were not being recognized, that for too long, policymakers in the region had hoped and expected that continued development and work in industries like coal and natural gas would yield long-term job growth and prosperity, when in fact, for a variety of reasons, they could not. And so ORVI was begun for the explicit purpose of both helping people understand the shortcomings in those industries and why they could not serve as foundations for prosperity, but also to help the region discover alternative methods of developing not just industries that are more environmentally friendly and sustainable, but that deliver actual, genuine, and large-scale potential for job growth and prosperity.
Stuart kind of has explained a little bit about the landscape in Allegheny, Beaver, Butler County, with the steel industry dying. And so will you share that with them? Because I thought that was a really good perspective. And then from there, we can have Sean add in.
Sure. So my perspective, so my wife kind of grew up in the area. I didn't. I am a transplant. But from what I have seen in the decade or so that I've lived in the area, is that you have these satellite towns around Pittsburgh that really were crucial in helping the steel industry thrive. Bessemer is a town nearby where we live. It was a brick town. You have towns that did lime and cement and brick and all these other sort of ancillary aspects of the steel industry. And when the steel industry left Pittsburgh and Youngstown, all of those communities really were hit hard. And it seems to me that Beaver, in particular, was one of the few communities that really did an excellent job over the years of reinventing itself and kind of salvaging what was there. It has a really beautiful downtown Main Street, a lot of small businesses, a lot of beautiful homes that have been painstakingly renovated. And then the cracker plant came, and it seems almost like that would be the antithetical step to all of that work that was done to rehabilitate Beaver. And the work that you and others have done in sort of exposing the failed economic promises of that plant, I think, reinforces that. So, what are your thoughts on that assessment?
No, what you just described is a very real phenomenon. I mean, when I go back, Wheeling, when I was growing up in the late 50s and 1960s, had twice the population that it does now. And so the collapse of the steel industry that you just referred to, and declines in the mining industry as well have had, yeah, a profound impact on the region that's been ongoing for the better part of 40 years now. And so I can understand why, when the natural gas boom began, when we had landmen running around offering people royalties and leasing fees, that county commissioners and others who were responsible for economic development absolutely jumped at the opportunity, because there really hadn't been anything promising for the better part of 4 decades. But at the same time, I and a few other folks recognized that in that particular case, the natural gas industry and ultimately also downstream industries like petrochemicals, like the Shell cracker plant, were not going to be engines of economic revival. And that's because they were structurally incapable of doing that. And so before the Ohio River Valley Institute even started, I organized a group of 8 economists from leading universities around the region, Ohio State, Carnegie Mellon, Pitt, WVU, and others, to write an open letter to the governors of Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia, saying to them that this vision that you have of a new petrochemical cluster in the greater Ohio Valley, which would be built upon the foundation of the natural gas industry, is simply an economic non-starter. It's not going to happen. And we're making a grievous mistake in premising virtually all of our economic development strategies on that thing working out. And of course, that's when I got to meet Jill for the first time, because she was very active in the opposition to a proposed ethane cracker plant like the cracker in Beaver that was going to be built in Belmont County, Ohio. And I think, Jill, you were with me on one of the occasions when we met with the county commissioners in Belmont County. And I said to them, the cracker is almost certainly not going to be built. And frankly, even if it were built, it won't make a significant difference economically in the region. And, unfortunately, both of those facts have been borne out by experience, because when you look at the experience of Beaver and the cracker, which, as you pointed out a moment ago, seems to be almost a deviation from a strategy that had to at least some degree been working,
Mhm.
that's very much the case. Because, when you look, for instance, at employment, at total jobs in Beaver County, what you see is that starting in about 2008, jobs started declining in Beaver County, which is true for a lot of counties in the region. There was a spike in employment during peak construction of the cracker around 2019, early 2020. But then, upon completion of the cracker, or at least major construction on the cracker, employment plunged, and it plunged even farther than the low it had achieved prior to construction of the cracker. So that today, employment jobs in Beaver County are at their lowest point since in this century.
Hmm.
And what that speaks to specifically is that the promise that was made for petrochemical development in our region is that facilities like the Shell cracker plant, which produces ethylene and polyethylene, the raw material for plastics manufacturing, and the 4 or 5 other plants that were envisioned cropping up in this region, like the proposed one in Belmont County, were supposed to become engines for economic growth, because the narrative was that they would attract downstream development from the manufacturers of various kinds of products that involve plastics. And that is the other illusion that's been swept away now that we've seen the cracker in Beaver County in reality, because in fact, there has been no downstream development by manufacturers of plastics products or anything else as a result of that cracker. And so, yeah, the bad news is that the message that we tried to encapsulate in that letter to the governors of Ohio, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania has frankly come true. And so right now, the Ohio River Valley Institute basically functions on two parallel tracks. One track is to try to educate policymakers, especially in the region, but folks generally, on what can and cannot be expected of the natural gas and petrochemical industries in our region, while at the same time developing economic development opportunities and ideas that are viable and that do take advantage of the energy transition that's taking place in the country, that will allow us to ride that wave rather than try to fight against it.
And that's just thank you so much. I'm always so grateful when I have a chance to connect with you, and I always learn so much. But there's one thing that I think you might be able to speak the best to, which is basically all of this you said. I mean, all the failed promises. I mean, this idea of the boom and bust cycles, and certainly, the shell cracker failed on every measure of economic development, right? And didn't meet any of their promises, which was what the plant was sold on. Um, but then you could get into the economic, what was it, economic development study, or there was some study that
The
was uh,
economic impact study.
impact study. Yeah, that who tell us about that? Who initiated it? And in the end, it was just garbage, right? I mean, it wasn't based in reality or fact, and that's what the governor and others used to bring this forward and justify all the other thing we want to hear about is how much our tax dollars, my tax dollars, how much people's tax dollars are paying to support these industries, not only petrochemicals but fracking too.
Yeah. Well, there have actually been a number of economic impact studies that were done sponsored by the industry, but there are three that stand out in prominence. The first of those was done back in 2009, published in 2010, by a guy named Timothy Considine from the University of Wyoming. It was a study that was commissioned by the American Petroleum Institute, and it was specifically focused on the economic impacts of a natural gas boom, a fracking boom in the region. And at the time, that particular study was only for um, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and New York State. New York State ultimately became a non-factor because they banned fracking. But it was very much in play in West Virginia and Pennsylvania. And that study anticipated the creation between the two states of about 250,000 jobs,
I
was
remember
the
that.
claim. And what's interesting was the assumptions that were made in that study regarding the amount of natural gas that would be produced have actually been exceeded.
Hmm.
Far more gas has been produced than were envisioned in that particular study. But at the same time, employment did not grow at all. I mean, it just did not. And in fact, when you look at the 22 counties in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia that produce 90% of all Appalachian natural gas, they now have collectively, since as compared to the beginning of the fracking boom in 2008, they have actually experienced a net loss of jobs and an even greater, and this is critical, an even greater loss of employment. And, we know what a lot of the flaws in that initial economic impact study were. They made a series of assumptions that were completely unrealistic, both about the number of workers that would be required for each well that was dug, but also about the amount of downstream economic activity that would result from the development of those wells, because we now know that only about 8% of every dollar that's spent on fracking even goes toward labor. And we know that in the case of fracking, much of that labor comes from areas outside of ours,
Yes.
to workers from Louisiana and Texas and Oklahoma and places like that. And so very little of the money that, I mean, a great deal of money has been generated from natural gas production, but very, very little of it actually enters local economies in the greater Ohio Valley. And that's why the economic impact has been almost non-existent in the region. The second study that's kind of seminal in this little journey was done by Robert Morris University, and it was specifically associated with the cracker plant. First, the American Chemistry Council, which is another industry organization, had done its own study envisioning the development of a petrochemical cluster in the greater Ohio Valley, one that would theoretically in size rival the petrochemical cluster in the Gulf Coast. And specifically as part of that, in the American Chemistry Council study, they envisioned and predicted the construction of 5 world-class ethane crackers on the scale of the cracker in Beaver County. And they imagined that downstream from that cracker would result a great deal of manufacturing and other kinds of businesses. Well, we now know, and that was back in 2017. Here we are 7 years later, and only one of the crackers was ever constructed and none of the other projects. And again, we know the reasons why. And it's, Jill, this is why we were making this point 2 or 3 years ago to the county commissioners in Belmont County. And that is that, frankly, there wasn't sufficient demand in the world for the amount of plastics that they were talking about producing in this region. And there was very little growth in plastics consumption in North America. And the places where there was growth were places like Asia. And Asia and the Gulf Coast were experiencing at the time their own build outs of new capacity to produce ethylene and polyethylene. And so, again, that was largely ignored in the American Chemistry Council study. And so we emphasized that fact, and that was part of what went into the letters to the governors. And then most recently, there's been yet another economic impact study, and that came from Robert Morris University, and it was commissioned by Shell, the owner of the cracker in Beaver County. And in that economic impact study, we found that it was simply riddled with flaws. And probably the greatest evidence of that is simply the numbers, the facts, the record. There has been net employment loss in Beaver County and surrounding counties, not employment growth. The predictions that they had for what the cracker would or could contribute to the economy have gone entirely unrealized. But when you look at the report itself, as one of our staffers, a fellow by the name of Nick Messenger, an economist who we employ, who's based in Ohio, he found that the study that they produced was simply riddled with methodological errors that contributed, so that not only were a number of assumptions flawed, but they literally, in many cases, looked at the wrong categories of data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis and other sources within the federal government. And so, the bottom line to this is that both the reality that we're now living and the expectations for what folks, many policymakers in the region have for what's coming are an illusion. They are fantasy. We've seen that already, certainly with the natural gas industry and now with the shell cracker. But at the same time, we've seen that, we still have state legislatures allocating literally billions of dollars. I think, Stuart, you asked, how much did the Shell cracker get? The answer is $1.6 billion in state tax subsidies, which I believe is the largest subsidy ever given to a single project in Pennsylvania history. And for that, frankly, Pennsylvania has received no measurable economic benefit as a result.
And pollution and suffering in the community. I mean, once it became operational, the Shell cracker plant had exceeded its volatile organic compound
Within months.
limits within months. For the total they were supposed to emit in a year. And that's the other thing we've talked about, like how many tons of cancer-causing pollution is it allowed within its permit limits each year? I mean, it's just, even that's insane. Of course, industry has to operate, but even
Yeah, I don't remember the exact number off the top of my head, 530 tons or something. Over 1 million pounds of VOCs is the allowable limit per year. And it exceeded that within a few months of operation. And it's exceeded that a few times, I believe, correct?
I believe you're right. I mean, frankly, I don't follow the environmental impacts of the plant all that closely, although, I obviously talk with people who do on a regular basis. But what you're pointing to, Jill and Stuart, is that, for so long in our region, going back to when I was a kid and before, and I can remember this back when, for instance, the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act were being considered in Congress, and both of which were enacted in 1971 when I was 15 years old. And I can still remember the debates and the arguments that were taking place back then. And almost always they were framed as jobs versus the environment. And, to be blunt, that's an argument that we folks on our side regularly lost because, as it turned out, most people wanted jobs more than they particularly cared about a lot of the issues that you just raised, Jill. And part of the reason that the Ohio River Valley Institute was founded was to be able to make the point that that framing of the debate, that framing of the issue, is simply factually incorrect. That we're not getting, I mean, even if it were, and many of us would debate this, I don't think it's a good trade-off. But even if you were willing to trade off the environment and your health and the health of your kids for jobs, you're still not getting the jobs. And that's really been the focal point, and what I hope anyway, that the Ohio River Valley Institute has brought to the discussion.
Now, one thing I'm curious about is because I've read some of the reports that have come out since the opening of the cracker plant that have exposed the failure of these promises. But you were saying that before then you knew that it wasn't going to work. What was that based on? How did you know that this was a bad bet even before it became a decision?
Well, I mentioned, yeah, that there are structural characteristics about these industries that make them lousy foundations upon which to try to build economic development. And just to rattle a few off, the first is that natural gas production, fracking, is literally the least labor intensive sector in the entire US economy. And I referred a moment ago, for instance, to the fact that only about 8 cents in every dollar that's generated from the sales of natural gas or that's invested in producing natural gas ever goes to labor. And then when you take into the account that both with the Shell cracker plant, but also with the natural gas industry, because our region had no heritage in those industries before, we didn't have an ecosystem of firms that supply services to the construction of crackers or fracking wells or their operation. And so as a result, the folks who were investing in developing fracking pads and investing in building the uh, shell cracker, they acquired those services from other places. I mean, we all saw, the white pickup trucks with Oklahoma and Texas plates running around on our roads everywhere. And when you look at the workforce at the cracker plant, even during construction, large portions of that came from out of state as well, although that was a big enough project while it was under construction to employ lots of folks from our area as well. But those were temporary jobs, and we knew that too. Um, we also knew that the construction of these things would have local economic impacts that harmed other sectors of the economy. So, for instance, during the period of time when the shell cracker was being produced, you couldn't find an electrician to work on anything else because they were all working up at the crack. And so, almost, and when you look around the counties around Beaver County during the period when the cracker was under construction, construction in all other counties actually declined. And in large part, it was because it consumed the labor pool. Um, and and then a third part, and Joe, you alluded to this earlier, the natural gas industry in particular is, like many extractive industries, a boom and bust industry. And so when construction started and it relied heavily on workers from out of state, even though there was a huge sudden demand for housing, nobody built any more housing. And the reason was because it's a boom and bust industry. That demands, people knew that's going to go away. If I build something today, inside of 2 years, there may not be a need for it anymore. And so two really bad things happened. We got a huge run up in rent prices because you had all these workers looking for places to live, and many of them ended up living in man camps in various places, which I think we all experienced somewhat. But at the same time that they were driving up rents in the area, the driving up of rents actually accelerated the loss of young people from the region, because who is it that rents apartments in places? Who, folks, oftentimes they're folks who are relatively young or just starting families and doing other things. And so even though we're in an area that has an excess or had an excess of housing because of population loss, the problem actually got exacerbated. And so not only did these industries fail to deliver on the promises as Joel described a few moments ago, in many ways, with that and the pollution and other quality of life issues that they precipitated in the area, they actually damaged economic viability. And so the sad part is that, and I'll give credit, there was an economist back in 2010 at Bucknell University, a guy named Tom Kinnaman. And although it got almost no notice at the time, Kinnaman didn't exactly predict that this would happen, but he did cite the distinct possibility that natural gas production could rise to incredible levels, but have almost no measurable impact on the economy. And many of these are the very reasons that he cited back at that time, and he was right.
So why is it that people in leadership positions, people who are making these economic impact studies, how can they get it so wrong? I mean, is it just that they want to believe that the illusion is real, or are they just operating on false premise?
Stuart, I'm going to play the old guy card on you on this one, because I actually have a great deal of compassion for a lot of the folks who welcomed this industry in and supported it and made the decisions that have made what has happened possible. And that is, if you were a county commissioner back in 2008, 2009, and a guy like Aubrey McClendon, who is kind of the godfather of the natural gas fracking industry, walked into your office, as he did with many county commissions, and he walked into your office and he said to you, "Hey, I want to invest $2 billion in your county." What are you going to say when you're a county commissioner who's trying to figure out how to make ends meet in a county that's been losing population and jobs for the better part of 40 years? You're probably going to say something like, "How can I help?"
Exactly. And
Mhm.
And I mean, I understand that when you've come through literally decades of nothing going your way, and somebody holds out the promise of anything, especially an industry that's not known in the region, that's not understood, I can understand why folks said, "Hey, let's give it a shot. Like, what do we have to lose?" Um, and I think that's really important because I do, as Jill knows, and she's done it with me, I do sit down with county commissions and mayors and folks from around the region who are policymakers. And there is something really compelling about the notion of, I'm going to invest a billion or $2 billion in your county. I mean, people have a hard time imagining that. I mean, how can you invest $1 billion in a community the size of Lawrence County or Belmont County and not have, it's going to do something, certainly.
but it didn't in Beaver. Isn't that what's right? That and the facts are the facts. You can't argue with it. I mean, you can deny it, but it did nothing but hurt it in the end on many levels,
It
right?
didn't. But to Stuart's point, understanding why that is took study and it took experience because it does seem to defy common sense. And let's be clear, I mean, Cleveland State University, for instance, tracks natural gas, cumulative natural gas investment in Ohio going back to the beginning of the fracking boom. They have now tracked over $100 billion invested in Ohio.
100 billion in just Ohio, in just Ohio, in
Yeah,
just Ohio.
without having any measurable, it does defy common sense. And so I can understand, county commissioners saying they're going to invest $1 billion here. Like, how can that not have some impact, some benefit? And it takes a lot of explanation to unbundle how that can actually happen. And the corollary to that is that, one of the things the Ohio River Valley Institute does is that we do try to promote economic development strategies that are highly productive. And one of the questions that I'm confronted with regularly, and this came up in Belmont County among others, is I was proposing a program that would have cost about $50 million for economic development in Belmont County. And I think it was Jerry Eshelman, one of the commissioners in Belmont County, said to me, he said, "So how is it the fact, or how is it going to be the case that you're saying you can invest $50 million in Belmont County and achieve effects that are greater than $1 billion invested by the natural gas industry?" The answer to that question, isn't intuitively obvious. And it's
Right.
a fair question, but it takes learning, it takes analysis, and it takes understanding. And that's something that it frankly just takes time to develop. And even when you've developed it, even when you understand it, it takes time and effort to disseminate the news and educate people and help people begin to recognize what the underlying dynamics are so that they can understand why and can use that knowledge to make better decisions going forward.
I do understand that in terms of natural gas and the fracking boom. It's a little harder for me to understand it in terms of the cracker plant though, specifically because they were exempted from so many taxes, and it's hard for me to imagine anybody sitting down and saying, we're going to give this company the largest collection of subsidies in the state's history. We're going to exempt them for 20 years on all these various taxes, and we're still going to get more than we're giving up. So where did that, how was that math working out for the people who were supporting this?
Um, well, it's not, except they think it is. And I'll tell you why. And I hate to keep bringing this back to natural gas, but you have to understand that the $1.6 billion subsidy that Pennsylvania granted the Shell cracker, the argument in the legislature for that was that, and specifically, it was for the cracker to use Pennsylvania natural gas. That $1.6 billion subsidy is actually a discount that is applied to natural gas that the cracker purchases as long as the natural gas comes from Pennsylvania. And so the motivation for that subsidy wasn't just associated or even primarily associated with the cracker plant itself. It's because Pennsylvania policymakers believed and had internalized the notion that natural gas development was good. And so anything that they could do to increase consumption of Pennsylvania natural gas would therefore be good for the economy as a whole. And what's astonishing is that that same logic still exists today, and we're seeing it in new policy decisions that are being made in Pennsylvania. So, for instance, there is a major push in Pennsylvania to try to construct in the Delaware Bay a new liquefied natural gas export terminal in the Port of Philadelphia. Why do they want to do it? Because it will create a new market for Pennsylvania natural gas. There is a bill that was recently passed in the Pennsylvania legislature to facilitate the use of carbon capture and sequestration in various industries. Why was it passed? Because the principal 2/3 of all the capturable carbon in Pennsylvania comes from gas-fired power plants. It will help perpetuate the market for natural gas. And so the cracker, the LNG export terminal, the carbon capture bill in Pennsylvania, these are all things that still are motivated by the same fundamental and utterly mistaken premise that natural gas development is economically good for Pennsylvania.
It's like a snake eating its own tail.
it's it's kind of mind blowing, when you put it all together like that. But I can tell you, living kind of on the front lines of oil and gas and petrochemical development, it's obvious it's not good for anything. I mean, when you hear, not only see the devastation to the environment and the amount of fresh water they're using to frack, to the emissions coming off of these. I mean, you could just go on and on. And the waste and the radioactive issues and placing irresponsible placement of all the waste processing facilities and the pads. But to rein it back in a little bit, I just want to take it back to when we met with the Belmont County Commissioners. And this is years into our fight to promote the truth, which is that the cracker plant was going to fail on these promises, and that the fact that fracking, tying in the impacts and the devastation of fracking and making the connection, which a lot of people still don't know, that the cracking for plastic, it's all fossil fuel based, it's all fracking based. But we were also trying to promote. That's why when the Ohio River Valley Institute kind of showed up on the scene after we'd been fighting fracking for years, and in the PTTG cracker plant, and watching and seeing the Shell cracker plant be built was, like ultimate motivation to work even harder to keep it from coming into our backyards. We didn't want it in their backyards, but nobody's backyards, right? So the institute was formed, and so we finally had the backup we needed with the data, the researchers to say, here are the economics. This is why the cracker plant in Beaver County's failed. This is why it's going to fail here. And then the miracle other part of this, which is an alternative, another path, diversify the economy and, economic development ideas. So we went into that commissioner meeting to, lay out the facts about why fracking has failed, why petrochemical development's failing on the promises. And then you presented the Centralia model, correct? And if you don't mind, I mean, I think it's really powerful. And for us, like I said, it was the missing piece in the support that we needed to actually have experts with the time, energy, resources to present a concrete, real life situation where they shifted and implemented a system that actually uplifted, benefited without the pollution. So just tell us about that. And before you begin, I just want to say the response was after Sean presented this incredible report and solution alternative, it was like, well, if you ever find the money to do that, then we might want to talk to you or support it, right? But although they've been for 8 years putting their hopes in this petrochemical scheme, that's never going to happen. Anyway.
Well, the Centralia model, as you just explained, Jill, is an economic development strategy. And it came about as a result of the fact that I happened to fall in love about 10 years ago and decide to get married to someone in the Pacific Northwest. And so I moved from West Virginia to just outside of Seattle, Washington. And I went to work for an organization called the Northwest Energy Coalition, which was involved in trying to figure out a solution for, believe it or not, an old coal town in Washington state. Such a thing actually exists. It's a town called Centralia, which is about halfway in between Seattle and Portland, Oregon. And Centralia is, as I said, literally an old coal town whose largest employer for decades was a coal mine, employed about 650 people. Second largest employer was a coal-fired power plant that employed another 350 people. And the mine had closed, and the power plant was scheduled to close back in 2016 when I got here and started looking at it. And the state of Washington had negotiated with the plants and the mine's owner a transition fund, an economic transition fund of $55 million. And I saw at the time how that money, how the community intended to invest those funds, and they were primarily in areas of energy efficiency, meaning they were going to help homeowners, business owners, local governments make energy efficiency upgrade, new doors and windows, insulation, new heating systems, new appliances, and other things. And they were going to invest a part of that money in education, including worker retraining from the mine and the power plant and that sort of thing. But what I noticed was that the pattern of investment that they had in mind, when you talk about things like HVAC and door and window replacement and insulation, and those are services that are provided by local contractors, local businesses. And unlike the fracking industry, they're spectacularly labor intensive, where the fracking industry only channels about 8 cents for every dollar into labor. They generally put about 60 cents of every dollar into labor. And again, all that labor is local.
Right.
And so I saw what might happen in Centralia. And back in 2016, I started following it statistically just to watch, because that was the year that the grant program was implemented and they started handing out these energy efficiency grants. And so in the next 4 years, by 2021, we had accumulated enough data that we could at least begin to render a judgment on what had happened in Centralia. And so this community, whose economy for the past, going back to the mid 1990s, was statistically almost identical to the economies of Belmont County and Ohio County in West Virginia and Marshall County. In 2016, Centralia started adding jobs for the first time in decades, and they did so at twice the rate of the US economy.
Wow.
And incomes also grew 50% faster than in the US economy as a whole. And what was wild about it is that continued year after year after year. And we only got right up to the edge of the COVID epidemic. So, but we managed to get 4 years of data in that we could look at. And it was just absolutely astonishing, especially for a place whose economy had been stagnant, who was losing its largest employers, and this is important, did not add a single major new employer in that 4 year period.
Wow.
Growth that Centralia experienced was bottom-up growth. It happened almost entirely from within the existing economy.
That's incredible.
And so we did a report in 2021 summarizing what had happened in Centralia. And frankly, I don't have the statistical chops to be able to really demonstrably distinguish between correlation and causality. And I knew the question of, I mean, did this just happen spontaneous? I mean, like, why did this happen? I mean, what? We knew that the grants program started, and we knew that the economic growth started simultaneously. But the question was it causal? And so about a year ago, year and a half ago now, Orvie commissioned the economics department at Ohio State University, where they do have the statistical chops to do this kind of analysis, to go out and answer two questions about Centralia. The first question was there a causal relationship? Did the grants program, really, was it largely responsible for the economic impact that we've witnessed? And the second question was, is Centralia's economy sufficiently similar to economies in the Ohio Valley that it would be reasonable to think that if the same strategies were applied here, we might experience the same kinds of results? And to make a long story very short, Ohio State looked at those two things quantitatively and came back with the answer of yes to each of those questions. The grants program, the transition grants program, was a primary driver of what had happened in Centralia. And yes, that economy is sufficiently similar to economies in our region that we could reasonably expect the same things to happen here.
And what I love about this is it could start right now. There's no infrastructure that needs to be built. We've got all the labor force already here that's trained. We just need the money, like back to what the Belmont County Commissioner said. Well, where's the money? Show me the money. It has to be able to be found. It has to be possible.
We identified 7 economic multipliers that were triggered by the grants program in Centralia. One of those is exactly what you're talking about right now, Jill, and that is energy efficiency is always shovel ready.
Yeah.
You don't need a lot of economic planning. Households don't need a lot of economic planning to say, gee, we'd like to really replace that old furnace on our house, or get better doors and windows in here, or insulate the place. It's a lot of people making a lot of simultaneous decisions to go do something. And those simultaneous decisions collectively, yes, have a powerful economic impact. And that's one of the most attractive things about the Centralia model.
I mean, we're touching on things that have been fascinating to me for a long time, much longer than just my time working with Jill. I've years ago, I stumbled upon the work of an economist out of, I think, Missouri State. His name is John Eichard. He's an agroeconomist, and he coined this term, the economic colonization of rural America. And he talks a lot about how the economic thinking of, you have this large anchor company that comes in and then produces all of this economic growth in these small towns. It just doesn't really pan out that way often. And I'm wondering if that thinking is a an artifact from when we did have large, like, steel mills and auto companies and things that did produce a lot of jobs, but we now don't really work that way. Factories are so modernized now that you don't really need that kind of workforce to run them, power plants, etc. Is that just an artifact that we need to shed, or is there some validity to it at all?
Whether it's an artifact or not, it is a notion that we do desperately need to shed. And I'll give you a couple of examples. It's ironic that in the listing of examples that you just cited, you mentioned power plants. Lots of people, especially in a state that calls itself, as Pennsylvania does, and as West Virginia and Ohio do as well, they call themselves energy states. They are proud of the fact that they export energy. They produce more energy than they consume, and they export energy. And it's genuinely believed that that is a foundation for economic prosperity in those states. And the sad irony is that what you just said is quite true in that industry. And I'll give a couple of real life examples in our area. I think, Jill, in Guernsey County, they just started up about a year and a half, 2 years ago now, an 1,800 megawatt gas-fired power plant there, which was kind of the economic development gem for Guernsey County. And in Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania, southeast of Pittsburgh, they also have a major, Tenaska is the name of the company that owns a power plant there. It's about I think a 1,200 megawatt plant, if I'm not mistaken. In those two counties, the Guernsey County power plant, as big as it is and as impressive as it is, you can drive by on the interstate and it sits there right beside the interstate, looks cool as hell. It employs all of 30 people. It employs about as many people as a supermarket or you know, an Olive Garden.
Yeah.
Except an Olive Garden actually makes something that's really good to eat, but it just is not a major contributor of job or economic development because very little, although it generates a ton of electricity, which generates a ton of revenue, none of that revenue actually lands in the local economy other than through the paychecks of 30 people. And 30, I mean, I'm not knocking 30 jobs. 30 jobs is good. 30 jobs that you might not otherwise have is good. That's wonderful. But it is way too small to make a measurable difference in the total economic prospects of even a county as small as Guernsey. And the same thing is true with the Tenaska gas-fired plant in Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania. They actually have fewer utility jobs now than they did before that plant was built, even though they point to it as being a great economic development engine. It has contributed almost nothing economically to that region. But nonetheless, the cult of the shiny object, the notion that, if you get something that looks big and it's white, they always like to make them white. if you make them big and white, that somehow impresses people as being economic development in much the way that the fracking boom did. The fracking boom didn't have one big building or even two or three big buildings, but it had all those damn white trucks running around on our roads going hither, thither, and yon. And all that activity, and people, yes, imagine they see that and they think, oh, that's something. It's something's happening here, just like those big shiny objects on the horizon. But oftentimes they may not be. And part of the reason for that, by the way, is that power generating industry, that's the second least labor intensive sector in the entire US economy.
And oil and gas development is first.
Yeah, fracking and oil and gas extraction are the worst. This is the second worst. And unfortunately, those are exactly the foundations upon which policymakers in our region have largely tried to build economic development. And that, Stuart, goes back to a question you asked before. Yeah, this is why I say that they are structurally incapable of being foundations for economic development.
But then when you get into how they sold fracking, which then immediately turned into cracking to make plastic and the petrochemical build out, we were basically lied to. I mean, even with the one thing, the representative who was behind and going to Thailand, PTTG was a Thai owned company, and he was stating thousands of permanent jobs, and then maybe it was 1,000 permanent jobs, but in fact, it's 300 to 400. So that's a pretty big. I mean that. So one way, just one example, but then we were sold on energy independence, and that we could keep our soldiers at home. And wouldn't it be great to not rely on foreign oil and gas supplies, whatever. It was about energy independence, and then they made fracking about energy. But in fact, early on in the fracking boom, we started hearing about the cracker plant and the petrochemical build out. And so really it was about fracking for cracking to make plastic. And we were also told we were going to get royalties for 50 years. So people signed these leases, and then, maybe they get a sign on bonus. And then if once the well is producing, yeah, maybe they got some significant checks for a little while, but then the wells instantly go into decline. And so the royalties were gone pretty quickly too. And so I don't know where I'm going with this, but there were and the jobs. I mean, you said that, but the jobs that were available to the local workers. I just spoke to a former brine truck driver yesterday who was talking about how they wouldn't maintain the trucks, and he would keep going. The brine trucks keep going to the company. The brakes are bad. It's not working right. You need to maintain these trucks, and they wouldn't. And so he was in accidents because um the local workers are the least valued assets of this industry. And we're giving the worst jobs, least pay, no benefits, had to work horrible hours. And they are the oil and gas industry workers are also the frontline community members who receive the worst impacts. I mean, they are getting the worst of the worst with the fracking, as far as health impacts and being exposed to things that they're not told about, the radioactivity. I mean, they're lied to as well.
Well, let's actually, you've raised a couple of really important points that are almost never made with respect to this industry. And like so much of the work you and I have done, you have stated, in a beautiful summary fashion based on personal experience, what you're seeing around you. Now I'm going to throw some numbers at you to support precisely the points that you've been making. First of all, to the issue of jobs, to the degree, we've talked about jobs in this conversation, we've been talking about on an economy-wide basis. Did fracking or any of its downstream industries lead to job growth generally? And the answer is no. But the other thing that people seem to be largely unaware of is that if you look just at the natural gas industry itself since 2019, it has been shedding jobs also. Since between 2019 and 2022, the natural gas industry in Ohio and in Pennsylvania laid off 3 out of every 10 workers. Employment just even in those industries declined by 30%, even though during that time production was still rising. And that tells you something about the nature of those industries. And it's also why, Jill, going to your example of the truck driver, they can be pretty ruthless when it comes to jobs because the number of jobs is declining. And as the number of jobs decline and people get more desperate for them, then there's less and less pressure on the company to pay good wages or to provide decent working conditions.
Right.
It's it's a buyer's market in that world, and that's what you just gave us a great example of the results of. The another point that you made in what you just said had to do with the concept of energy independence. And again, I'm old enough, and you can see a blog post at Orvie that talks about this. I was there when the concept of energy independence was first conceived. And it was during particularly what was then called the Arab oil and gas embargo in the very early 1970s, when we had lines at gas stations and people were running out of heating oil in New England and things were generally awful. And President Nixon, went on the air to talk about the need for energy independence. And ever since then, it's been a catchphrase in US politics. And the notion that's always been communicated about energy independence is the notion that, going back to what was then called the Arab oil embargo, we're going to produce enough energy that if you say you're going to cut us off like you did at that time, we'll be able to say to you, so what? We got our own. What you do isn't going to affect us. Well, that's not really how it worked. Oh, we now produce more oil and natural gas than we use. In that sense, we already are energy independent. But something else didn't happen as part of that promise. That implication that we would be in a position to say, hey, regardless of what OPEC does or what Russia does, if it decides to invade another country, we're going to be okay because we make our own. That notion never came to fruition. And that's because oil, and now, although this didn't used to be the case, but it is now, natural gas and oil are part of global markets. And
Important.
so the fact that we produce our own natural gas, if that natural gas is being sold to European markets or Asian markets, and Russia decides to invade Ukraine, then that's going to affect the prices that we feel here because the producers are going to chase the prices wherever they're the highest, wherever they can get the most for their product. And that's going to produce scarcity here and drive up prices here. And so when I hear a politician use the phrase energy independence, I want to scream at him, what the hell do you mean?
Right.
Because if you mean that we're going to use our natural resources to meet our own needs, I may take what you're saying seriously and we can have a conversation about that. But if you simply mean that we're going to produce enough oil and natural gas that we can export it elsewhere, but that we're going to be completely engaged in global markets, then I know that you're not even remotely serious and that your phrase energy independence is utterly meaningless because we are no less at the mercy of global markets to the degree that we're participating in those markets than if our energy were produced in other countries. It becomes a difference without distinction. And so I bridle whenever anybody raises the concept of energy independence because as the industry acts and as most politicians mean, that concept is utterly worthless, except importantly, with respect to renewable energy, wind and solar power and battery power. That is energy that is developed and actually used here. But that's not what they're talking about, and we all know that.
No, but there is one very powerful way that they've succeeded by tossing around the phrase energy independence. I mean, I was in an Antero meeting where they were discussing their plans, I think, for a compressor station or fracking, and they were talking about the energy independence, and then an older man stood up and said, "Absolutely, I'll sign up. Where do I sign up? Because this is what we need. This is what we want." And so it works. People didn't question. They didn't get a lawyer. They didn't look at the lease. They're just like, "Well, if this is going to mean energy independence, sign me up right now," with no questions asked. So it was a powerful tool in creating the mess we're in right now, which is way too far down the fracking road. You know.
Oh, it's politically, it's been a very, very potent message for decades and decades and decades. But it's still the case that, like I said, when Russia invades Ukraine or OPEC decides to cut production, our prices for electricity go up just like everybody else's in the world's. It really doesn't make any functional difference. And that's the falsehood behind the claims of energy independence until and unless, we're willing to forego, or at least oil companies and natural gas companies are willing to forego the added profits that can be made from exporting this stuff overseas in favor of keeping low prices here, then we're not in any meaningful sense energy independent at all.
But you also could see how early on the petrochemical and plastic, uh, the cracker plants, that whole scene showed up. And so, do you agree with me that by design, it was a couple years before they even started talking? They had it in the works way before they announced it to us. But any way to keep, because in the end, fracking wasn't that, weren't they losing money? I mean, how much it cost to produce it, and how the prices in the market was down. Like, wasn't there something about just any way they could figure out a way to keep it going? So that's where I get a little confused, because I thought that for a while the frackers weren't actually making that much money because it was so intensive and costly to build out this infrastructure, and they didn't have a way to get it to market. They had to put in all these gathering lines, which aren't regulated by FERC and so dangerous. And anyway, I could go on and on. But am I making sense? Do you understand what my question is? Like,
Yeah, and my response is that actually many of the frackers, especially those at the beginning of the natural gas boom, did, and investors, especially their investors, got hammered financially.
right.
Because I mean, it wasn't like, it's easy to fall into the assumption that everywhere there's a loser, there's a winner, and somebody is gaining at the expense of somebody else. One of the tragedies of the natural gas fracking boom is that, at least for the first decade, pretty much everybody lost, except for the fact that natural gas prices did come down. And so, kind of generally, consumers of natural gas, whether they did it through, actual direct use of gas or through their electric bills, there was some savings. I mean, there were benefits economically to having lower gas prices. But interestingly, the developers, especially in those early days, typically overinvested and didn't realize great returns. And there was massive consolidation in the industry, which is frankly still ongoing.
Mhm.
And right now, I mean, so it is possible for people, investors, and very large companies to make bad investments that not only drag communities down, but drag themselves down too. And we, in fact, may be witnessing that right now with the Shell cracker. The shell cracker is struggling both financially and technologically at this moment, and it's not clear. And I know I have heard rumors from industry analysts that Shell would frankly like to sell that thing and get the hell out, which
But
may be the case, and that
The
may
which is
happen.
concerning because just like it's happened here when you said buying out, a lot of the bigger companies took off and sold their leases to these more, what do you call them, mom and pop, or
fly by
fly
nights.
by night, less developed, smaller companies. And I've had industry workers tell me that sometimes and more often, if anybody does things by the regulations or even close to it, it's the bigger, more developed countries. But we're at the stage where they're all gone. The truck's driving around. I don't recognize the name. Here's a new name there. Here's a new here. And I've had industry workers tell me that they absolutely do not do things by the book because number one, they don't have to because the regulators aren't watching. And number two, they can't afford to. So, like in the case of pipelines, there'll be a swamp, but they'll see the pipe is leaking. And they're like, we're just going to leave it because they can't afford to fix it, or and they don't have to because nobody's watching. But anyway, I don't know if I.
Well, no, what you just said again is really important because one of the things that, again, I think people have been slow to realize, and especially policymakers have been slow to realize, is that right now our region has entered, and we did a report on this a year ago in early 2023. We're entering a new era for the natural gas industry in Appalachia. It has stopped growing. I mean, between 2008 and 2020-ish, 21-ish, the industry was just regularly growing year after year after year. That was a constant line up. In Pennsylvania, Ohio, largely by 2019, 2020, we had pretty much topped out on production. We've plateaued. And in fact, production is expected to gradually start declining at a pretty slight rate, but nonetheless. And in that world, the kind of dynamics that you just described, Jill, become more prevalent because what had been, there's a saying in business that sales solves a lot of ills. If you just sell enough, you can afford to make a lot of mistakes. But we're entering a period with the natural gas industry where sales aren't climbing anymore. And when that starts happening to companies, they start looking for ways to reduce costs. And that's when many of the problems that you just described start to kick in a big way. When companies start looking for any means that they have of minimizing costs, they start cutting corners, both with labor, with regulations, and with anything else that they can. And that's what makes this a particularly concerning time for our region. And, I'm not sure that very many policymakers are really attuned to that fact and some of the new problems that are going to start presenting themselves, or from what your description, which already have started presenting themselves.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we've seen around where we live with frac pads, including the one that's right across from our farm, is that we're now on the fourth or fifth owner of that pad, and so what seems to be common practice is the larger companies that start have the bigger cost to recoup, and then they make a certain amount of profit, and then they cut and run. They either declare bankruptcy or they sell the lease to a smaller company, and then that creates this sort of cascade where every time the pad changes hands, it goes to a smaller, less reputable company. And then you get to this point where eventually the inevitable end is that it just becomes abandoned. And I think it was 2 years ago, Pennsylvania took something like $41 million from the federal government, and another big chunk of money from the state that they used to go around and cap abandoned wells, and to I don't even think they reclamate at that point, because I think the reclamation was that was the responsibility of the company. But now that the company's gone, I think they're just more concerned with capping the well, essentially. And so that's a pretty pervasive problem in itself, is just the end of the life cycle of a lot of these projects is abandonment.
Yeah, and frankly, fracking technology exacerbates that problem because one of the characteristics of fracking wells is that they are very highly productive at the very beginning, but the level of production from wells decreases very, very rapidly until a year or two after that well has been in operation. It functions and can continue to function for many years, but at a much, much lower level, which makes the value of that well far smaller than it was at the outset, which is why it attracts those kinds of, forgive me for using the phrase, bottom feeding companies that buy it up and operate it on really thin margins oftentimes.
One thing I wanted to talk more about is, a lot of this, when we talk about communities being lied to, or the false promises, a lot of this is predicated on these economic impact studies. And I wanted to talk more about how those are used, because those are used in like every industry. I remember years ago there was a proposed casino in one of our neighboring townships, and we went to the township meeting, and that was kind of the first time that what is it, IMAP, is that a IMAP is like in plan, that's right. That was the first time that came on my radar, and I started looking into it, and it seems like what what a lot of regular people think is this very formal, very official study is really nothing more than a piece of marketing a lot of times that's done by this third party consultant firm,
That's paid by the company.
that's paid for by the company. And so I think these economic impact studies, and likewise a lot of environmental impact studies, are fooling a lot of people. And I'd like to maybe explain a little bit more to sort of like the layman in the communities what's wrong with these studies and how they're used.
Yeah, it may not be entirely fair to call economic impact studies generally, or like Implan based studies in particular. And Implan, by the way, is a company, and Implan is the platform that they provide to calculate downstream economic impacts of various projects. It may not be quite fair to call it a pseudoscience, but it's pretty darn close. And when I say it's pretty darn close, what I mean is that you don't see academic papers that utilize Implan-based analyses or economic impact analyses because it doesn't rise to that level of rigor. Um, and even the results that are associated or that result from economic impact studies, people have very little understanding of what they actually mean. They think they understand what they mean, but in fact, they have very little understanding. And so, for instance, usually there are at least three kind of metrics that come out of economic impact studies that every politician who's shilling for a project latches onto. The first one is they'll talk about how much money is being invested. How much money is this going to bring into the local economy? Or they're going to invest X number of dollars in, Lawrence County or boom, boom, boom. The second one is how many jobs are supported. Now, hear that word that I just used, supported. That's a really critical word, and we'll come back to that in a minute. And then lastly, it's how much commerce will result from this. In other words, and that's another word that people think they know what it means, but they really don't. And so we've already talked earlier about investment. Saying that you're investing something in a community or an amount of money in a community doesn't really mean that that much money is going to show up in that local economy. For instance, in the Shell cracker plant, they bought the part of the investment was the steel that was used to build the plant. Well, guess what? They bought the steel in South Korea.
Exactly.
that is not money that in any meaningful sense is invested in Beaver County, Pennsylvania. Nonetheless, that was part of the narrative about the benefits of the Shell cracker plant. Let's go to the second one, jobs. They talk about jobs and that magic word support. What the hell does supported mean?
Right.
Does that mean we're going to get, in the case of the shell cracker, for instance, well, I don't know about the shell cracker, but for the petrochemical complex, that notion of 5 crackers, that was advertised as providing 100,000 jobs. It was actually, I believe, 108,000 specifically. Of that 108,000 supposed jobs that would be created, fewer than 10,000 of them were supposed to be jobs in the actual facilities that were going to be part of the petrochemical complex. The other 90 to 100,000 jobs were basically supposed to be jobs that are somehow downstream of that. Some of them they call indirect jobs, which means they're jobs at firms that aren't part of the complex, but maybe sell services to it or purchase services from it. So they're kind of directly related. But then there's even a third category of jobs that are called induced. And that the induced jobs are, well, I'm going to employ X number of hundred or X number of thousand people and pay them wages. And they're going to take those wages and they're going to go out and spend them in the local economy at the drugstore, at the grocery store, at, the hairstylist, and all of those other places. And that will in turn generate more jobs. And so what you end up with is a multiplier. And sometimes these industry studies, like the one I just mentioned for the petrochemical cluster, you will find that for every job that they're saying these facilities will create, they're inferring, they're estimating, they're ballparking that another 8, 9, or 10 will be created. And as you can imagine, there is a great deal of room for potential mischief in figuring out what multiplier am I going to use. I know someone who's near and dear to your heart, Jill, the coal baron, now deceased, Bob Murray, who lived out in St. Clairsville, Ohio. Bob Murray used to run around saying that for every job that the coal industry provides, 11 more jobs are created. And that becomes part of that support number. I mentioned to you in the case of the natural gas boom, that was supposed to, between Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia, that was supposed to provide between 450,000 and 500,000 jobs. And there
Over
are
what time
in-plan-based
frame?
estimates.
Over what time frame did they make that projection? You know,
It was over the time frame. I don't remember the exact number of years. It wasn't more than 10, but it was when they determined that production would basically reach a peak.
Hmm.
And
and
so,
that
yeah, it would have happened by 5 years ago, Jill, if it was going to happen.
And what do we know what the actual number was?
Yeah, about negative 10,000.
and you're not joking,
I'm
right?
not joking. No, I'm not joking. I mean it.
That's like net, right? Because a lot of people who are listening who know people who work in the fracking industry are going to have a hard time with that, right?
Yeah. So can you
So
go into that? Like, what does that mean? Like, so yeah, I know people who had jobs, but yeah, I'm trying to even comprehend what that really means to myself. I mean, so because certainly some jobs were created, but what? I mean, please help me
Okay,
understand.
we to try to figure this out, we did a special study in Pennsylvania specifically. And that the reason we did this is because a lot of people, when they saw our original they were termed the Appalachia reports. on the economic impacts of fracking in the 22 counties that I mentioned before that produce 90% of all Appalachian natural gas. One of the objections that we got to those reports, well, first, people denied that the reports were accurate, but unlike the implant studies that you just mentioned a moment ago, Stuart, we weren't doing any inference. We weren't doing any estimates. All that we did was go to the actual job numbers at the quarterly census of employment and wages in the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and we counted. So there wasn't any room for inference or bad math going on there. These were just the facts that these counties had lost jobs. And so once people kind of got hammered over the head with, hey, this is the record. We're not guessing at this, we're not estimating it. It's what it is, right? Once they got back, the next fallback objection that we got was that people said, well, the natural gas industry is doing its job. It's delivering a lot of new jobs. It's all the other sectors in the economy that are screwing up and falling apart. Okay, well, that's an interesting hypothesis. So let's test it. And so what we did was there's an Ohio River Valley Institute report called Misplaced Faith. And we happen to have in Pennsylvania a natural laboratory, the opportunity for a natural test. Pennsylvania has 30 counties that are not part of any metropolitan area. They're rural counties. And of those 30 counties, 10 of them were very heavily impacted by the fracking industry. In those counties, the fracking industry constitutes about a third of GDP, gross domestic product. In the other 20 counties, the fracking industry had almost no measurable contribution. In those counties, the share of GDP is between 2 and 3%. It's just not a major factor in those counties. And so what we did was look at the job, the income, and the population dynamics of those counties during the period of the fracking boom. And what we saw was this. It was really fascinating. When you looked at GDP, total output, in the rural fracking counties, GDP skyrocketed, which is what we had seen before in our Appalachia reports. They just started producing a lot more output, lots more money. But when you looked at jobs and income and population, there was literally no statistical difference between the fracking non-metropolitan counties and the non-fracking non-metropolitan counties. And in those counties, because as I'm sure you're aware, given that you live in Lawrence County, rural counties in Pennsylvania have been taking a beating in terms of population and jobs for a long time. And so in both the cases of jobs and population, they actually experienced declines, and they experienced them at the same rate. The fracking rural counties did slightly better than the non-fracking counties. Like they only lost 5.8% of their jobs compared to 6.1%. But on population, the fracking counties actually did worse than the non-fracking counties. But statistically, they were so close, there was no meaningful statistical difference. The point is that the fracking industry came, it drove GDP through the ceiling, but had almost no measurable impact. And what it also showed, though, was that when you separated the natural gas industry from the rest of the local economy, the rest of the local economies in both the fracking counties and the non-fracking counties looked almost identical. In other words, it wasn't a case where, fracking drove a lot of job growth, but the rest of the economy fell away. Now, the rest of the economy looked pretty much like it looked before the fracking started.
Hmm.
and no different from counties that didn't experience fracking. It's the fracking that didn't deliver. It isn't that their delivery or their benefits were somehow offset by declines elsewhere. Not at all. It was the fracking industry that just failed to deliver.
Hmm. And all of these reports that Orvie does are published on your website, correct?
Yeah, they are. Yeah, there's if you go to the website, you'll see in the upper navigation bar, there is a tab called Reports, and they are listed chronologically, and you can go back and see summaries. There are some 30 some reports now on this and other issues, so there's a lot to pick through.
And the report from Eric DePlace and can't remember the other lady's name, but
Julia Stone.
yeah, Julie. And that is called, what's the name of it? Read it
A
for me.
Cautionary Tale of Petrochemicals from Pennsylvania.
Okay. And then the one that preceded that, that kind of a similar style report was Frackalacha. And what's the full title of that one about the failed fracking economics?
Well, there are two formal Frackalacha reports. From 2023, there's a report called Frackalacha Update.
Right.
And from 2021 is the original Frackalacha report. And I honestly don't remember. It doesn't have Frackalacha in the title. That just kind of became a casual way of summarizing them. I don't even remember exactly what the title was. It's easy to spot though when you see the graphic because it has a map of Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Ohio with the 22 natural gas counties highlighted on it. So you'll see it instantly if you go to the website. And it's one of the first reports. In fact, it may even be the first report that Orvie issued.
So to go back to the economic impact studies, because this is I really think that this is an important thing that I think regular people in communities need to be aware of, because this is how these industries sell these projects to communities, is with these economic impact studies. There's a lot of assumptions in the studies regarding sort of like this static nature of the industry, continual growth, but there's also a lot of omissions in these reports, right, of critical information. Can you talk about that?
Well, one of the basically the greatest even if you assume that people who are doing in-plan-based economic impact studies are conscientious in what they're doing and not biased in what they're doing, there is a fundamental flaw in these analyses that simply isn't addressed at all. And that is they never deal with the issue of costs or price. What are the trade-offs associated with doing whatever project is being analyzed? And so you can look at, whether it's we're going to put up a factory to do this or we're going to have a whole industry come into an area. All of the resources that facility uses, whether it's the property, whether you're talking about the labor to build the thing and to run it, all of that could be used to do something else. And that something else isn't going to get done because this thing that's coming in is going to consume those resources. And so one of the mistakes that these studies, it's not a mistake because it's just not part of what they consider, is basically what is the alternative? What would happen or would have happened were this facility not going to be here? And what is being lost as a result of that?
And before we talk, Stuart brought up, which I didn't know this, that there was a zinc plant.
Horsehead.
Do you know about this, Sean?
No, I don't.
Horsehead was, I believe it was a zinc plating plant in the location of the shell cracker plant. And it had been there for a long time. And I had always thought that, I had heard about it because, I'm from the area, but I had always assumed that it had gone out of business years ago. But when I was reading about the Shell cracker plant, what I learned is that they issued the severance packages to their employees because Shell was going to buy their property. So they actually put some 600 some people out of work to shut that factory down to make the property available to Shell to buy. And now that Shell is operational, I believe they're only employing about 400 people. And so
Right.
this is kind of what you're talking about, and it's called an opportunity cost, right? Is that what it's like referred to?
No, that's very much the case. And many of the things that we've been talking about, when I mentioned that, the shell cracker basically consumed all of the construction trades workers for the better part of 2 years, that translated into lots of other things not getting built in and around the facility or in and around the Pittsburgh region. And yeah, so those trade-offs of what would have been or could have been, those are very real trade-offs. And they are almost never, well, it's not almost, they're literally not factored in to the equation. Um, and, when I said, for instance, and it's especially true when it comes to the employment statistics, when I mentioned supported jobs and you're talking about, well, how many ticket takers at the local movie theater are being supported because Shell happens to pay an engineer X amount of dollars and he goes to the movie once a week, right? I mean, it's what you're basically presuming, and this is why they use the word supported rather than provided. Although policymakers, when they say 100,000 jobs, policymakers think 100,000 jobs that we wouldn't otherwise have and that will be in addition to the ones we already have. And that's wrong. That is absolutely not what they mean. Because what happens is, like with the construction workers at the Shell cracker, most of them, if they weren't working on the Shell cracker, would have been working on something else.
Right.
Some of them might not have had jobs. Some of them might have not had as much employment, but most of them would have had something else to do. And whatever that something else to do is, didn't get done. And that's a cost. And so that whole cost side of the equation often does not kick in. And there are other holes in these analyses. When you create a facility as big as the Shell cracker with as much output, this new sudden supply of polyethylene or capacity to produce ethylene changes entire markets in terms of what they're worth. And so, for instance, I had mentioned that it wasn't only the shell cracker that got built in that time frame, but along the Gulf Coast and in Asian countries, they were building lots more crackers too. And as a result of that, we're now and will be for the next decade in a state where the capacity to produce plastics far exceeds the demand for it. And in that world, the use of cracker plants is declining. It used to be that cracker plants operated more than 90% of the time, around 95% of the time. They're now down in the 70s globally. And that's because there's excess capacity out there. And that's the kind of problem that these economic impact studies don't anticipate. They don't take into account the pricing or supply consequences in the overall economy of what these facilities are going to do. And so to a large extent, frankly, the Shell cracker cut its own throat. It brought new capacity onto the market at a time when the market didn't need new capacity. And as a result, the shell cracker, which is basically the latest kid in the game, they're probably suffering the most from this because a lot of other crackers had established customer relationships, and it's Shell that's out there now trying to find customers for capacity that's going unused.
Which tells me also that, we're at a point where environmentally we need to be shifting away from plastic. And that situation that you just described basically incentivizes finding uses for more plastic.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's not just plastic, it's natural gas too.
Right.
I mean, natural gas consumption is plunging in Europe. It is plunging in California. And I mentioned California because that's an eighth of the entire US economy. It's declining in Japan, which is another major economy. Yeah, there are, and that's part of the reason why there is such pressure on projects like the ones that we've mentioned, whether it's crackers or export terminals, to find markets for gas. And that's also why production is plateauing in Appalachia. They've kind of hit the top end as far as demand will support. And now they got a problem on their hands.
I'm confused because it's picking up here, Sean. I mean, I right out there. It's everywhere. The traffic's back. Not the white Ford trucks or the worker trucks, but the drill rigs, and so they're fracking and they're picking up here. Why? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. What's going on? Or they're rushing at the last minute to get as much out as they can, and these little smaller companies are coming in. And then what? To do what?
Actually, and this just depends on how current you are. In the first half of this year, fracking activity actually backed off. And that's because prices got so low for natural gas, they just couldn't support it. They're beginning to come back now. But one of the problems that drives exactly what you're talking about, Joe, is that I mentioned before that fracking wells only produce at a high level for a year or two after they go into operation, and then they start dropping off. That means that even though production is plateauing, to maintain that production, you have to still drill new wells.
Yeah.
It's not you can't it's not like I mean even coal mines, coal mines do reach an end of their life, but in most cases coal mines can produce at the same level for decades. Fracking wells are an entirely different creature. They are very productive at the outset and then they decline rapidly and operate at kind of a maintenance level for maybe even a couple of decades. But you've got to replace that lost spike in production, every year or two. And so it'll keep them coming. And frankly, that's one of the major downsides about the industry. It's not like you can just build it and then think, geez, now we can relax.
Yeah.
It won't stop as long as there is that demand. Yeah.
Exposure is brought to you by Ohio Valley Allies. To find out more and learn how to take action, please visit ohiovalleyallies.org. Stay tuned for upcoming episodes as we dive deeper into these crucial issues and speak with impacted communities, experts, researchers, and industry insiders.
Most people at this point, policymakers, even if they don't like it, kind of buy into the notion that we've got to decarbonize. And decarbonization, there are two routes to decarbonization. Most of the country is following the route of transitioning to renewable energy in some form or another. They may not be doing it as fast as I might like or otherwise, but generally speaking, that's what's happening in other places. But in our region of the country, because of its peculiar history, we're trying by and large to decarbonize to the extent that we are, not by replacing or transitioning away from fossil fuels into renewable energy, but by trying to figure out ways to perpetuate them. And so instead of transitioning, we're mitigating. We're talking about technologies like carbon capture and like hydrogen to try to retain the industries that we have while still reducing the emissions. And for the most part, it's not a particularly good way to go about it. It does a pretty bad job of decarbonization, and it's expensive as hell.
And it's unproven technology, right?
Yes. Yep. Oftentimes that's the case. Yep. If you'd like me to go deeper than that, it's Orvie as an institution was founded on the experiences of a similar institution based in Seattle, Washington, called the Sightline Institute. And Joe, I don't know if you were aware of this, but Eric DePlace, who you cited earlier as being the author of one of Orvie's reports. Eric was also a founder of the Sightline Institute in Seattle, which does work similar to Orvie, but in the Pacific Northwest. And so Eric was contacted by the folks at the Heinz Endowments in Pittsburgh to see if he would be interested in developing a comparable institution for the greater Ohio Valley region and northern Appalachia in general. And as it happened, I had moved fairly recent, well, 4 years earlier, um, to the Seattle area. And just in the work that I was doing out here on energy that overlapped with some of the work that Eric was doing, I got to know him socially. And literally, one night we were having dinner together, and he told me about this project he was working on for the Heinz Endowments and how he was trying to come up with a concept for how this might work and what it might do. But one of his disadvantages in trying to do that is that he knew nothing about the region. Had never really been here apart from a trip or two in. And he was completely unaware that I was from Wheeling and from the region.
I didn't know that.
And yeah, the running story is, and it happens to be basically true, is that I threatened him with bodily harm if he did not find a role for me to play in coming up with Orvie. And yeah, it was out of that that I had mentioned when we were talking earlier, the original letter to the governors about the shortcomings of the petrochemical industry's prospects in the region. That was in some ways a demonstration project for the Heinz endowments, to show them what could be done if uh, an organization like Orvie were created. And the letter, thankfully had a pretty considerable impact. It was picked up by newspapers in Columbus, Charleston, and Harrisburg. And although West Virginia's governor managed to ignore it, it did elicit responses from the governors of Ohio and Pennsylvania at the time. And just that fact that, and the letter was unique in that it went at the gas industry not on environmental grounds. It went at the industry or in the petrochemical industry on economic grounds. And we were frankly helped immensely by what was probably the industry's overreaction.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, it attracted a lot of their attention too. And I think because they went out of their way to try to refute it, they probably gave the report, the letter, um, more airtime than it probably would have gotten on its own.
Well, and that's exactly what we need to happen, like for them to pay attention, the industry to pay attention as well, and to even attempt to try to discredit it when it's based in reality and fact and data. They can't, but they try. And really, like you said, all it does is it creates more of a stir in the end. Yeah.
Well, in Orvie's strategic plan, I mean, one of the things that, Eric and I think the folks at Heinz recognized is that the first step in changing conditions in the region had to be to change the narrative, to change public discourse, because up until that point, basically the industry could say anything that it wanted, and no one would take issue with it for the most part. A few folks might complain about the environmental impacts, but with respect to their job claims, their investment claims, and all of that stuff, no one was basically calling them to account on it.
Well, and what Orvie did for us is it's like our lived experience, what we were seeing, what we were hearing, recognizing that, wait a minute, these are all these workers. Look at all the trucks. Look at the license plates. They aren't from here. So we could see and understood and had the lived experience of what was happening, but we needed backup. We needed the research. We needed the data. We needed the report. So it was just like, I am so grateful to Eric DePlace, one of my heroes, and also so grateful to the Heinz Endowments for their support in helping create Orvie and the tremendous support you have been, but also for many other um, ways they have funded and contributed to a lot of the success we've had in, at least exposing the truth and yeah. So I just needed to acknowledge that first, and yeah, that basically when you all showed up from Orvie, it was like, thank God, finally, we it was like a smoldering fire that could be ignited now, and so I'm just saying it continues on many battles and many fronts to be of tremendous resource. So thank you, even just being here today. Like I'm always so excited when you show up on my Friday calls and any chance because it's like and it because it's motivating. Your knowledge and power, I find incredibly motivating and impactful, and as well as the rest of the Orby team. And so, I just want to take a minute to say that, like, y'all have been a tremendous support and allowed our efforts to have greater impact for sure. And it was like the backup we needed. Yeah, and I've already said that. So,
No,
um,
thank you so much. And, in a way, Jill, it was kind of sad that Orvie was probably necessary because, as you just suggested, I mean, you don't have to be an economist, or you didn't have to be an economist in 2020 to know that there was no economic boom. There was no jobs boom going on. I mean, if you lived in Wheeling or Belair or Waynesburg, you could walk out your front door and look up and down the street. They talk about an economic game changer, which I don't know about in Pennsylvania, Stuart, but in West Virginia, the phrase economic game changer became something of a joke
Mm.
because it was invoked so often in reference to the natural gas boom, and like nothing happened. Yeah, you didn't have to be an economist to go out the door and look up and down the street and see that there was no economic boom taking place here.
Yeah. Yeah, it's something that we've seen in a lot of different industries, strip mining and timbering, and it's like this illusion that it's going to make people rich, and it's like, well, it didn't make you rich last time, but this time will be different.
and what point in history where will Appalachians receive the benefit from all the extraction, from all the development, from, they're using our precious natural resources and polluting them in the process and, breaking our backs. Like when I think about the coal miners who are working in this, a 3 foot space, bending down. I mean, but, and if just as I had a conversation recently with someone whose family had been coal miner, he'd been a coal miner, and like, well, we did well. Our family benefited. We could go to college, and I don't know where I'm going with this. It's just,
Well, the dynamic that you just mentioned, Jill, is very real. And again, statistically, we've been able to demonstrate it. The second or third report that Orvie did was called Destined to Fail. And it was about the natural gas boom and talking about some of the structural deficiencies in the industry. And one of the statistics that's pointed out there is that GDP, gross domestic product, is often used as kind of the catch-all statistic to assess economic health. And one of the points that you just made was, you asked, when are we going to start seeing the fruits of all the extraction that's done here and the value that it brings to the economy at large? Your perception that we're not getting our share of that is very, very real. In that report that I just mentioned, look at GDP, gross domestic product, on a per capita basis. The 22 counties that produce most of the natural gas coming out of Appalachia would rank, I believe it was ninth in the nation if they were a state in terms of the output per person. But when you look at the income per person, the per capita income, they rank 41st.
exactly. Wow.
And that is the discrepancy. That's the quantification of the point that you're making. And yeah, inherent, again, in economies that are dominated by some kinds of industries, and extractive industries and power plants are two of those. That's where you see that particular combination of statistics come bubbling to the surface. High output and low incomes going together. And that's a rarity, by the way, in the US economy. If you just look at the 50 states, almost, I think it's third of the 15 states that have the highest per capita income, 13 of them are also have the highest per capita GDP, and vice versa. In other words, there's almost complete overlap. Instances like ours, where GDP and income are completely disconnected, are exceedingly rare. And in fact, it's the definition. I mean, we've all heard the phrase the resource curse. This is exactly the statistical definition of the resource curse.
But isn't that also exploitation? I mean, can't that go hand in hand? I mean, why is it allowed? What's happening? I mean, because they come in here and they know that we're suffering and that most people are, at the poverty line or close to it, and there aren't many jobs, and so they can just come in and take advantage because they have no other option. And trust me, I've heard from oil and gas workers who, are kind of like the grunt of the operations, and so there's a blowout that happens on a pad, and he has to spend all night walking around in this radioactive, chemically laden brine, and then his feet are sore for days and has sores all over him. And he looks at me and says, I know I'm probably going to die from cancer, and I can't worry about what I'm doing to the environment that I'm leaving for my kids because they're hungry and I got to feed them now, and I can't find another job. Why is that allowed to be?
It's why, and if you think back to that meeting that we had with the county commissioners, one of the things that I told them, and we had written this even in the PowerPoint presentation that I think we took with us that day, that, as local policymakers, the two best things that they can do for economic development are, first of all, to try things like the Centralia model, which results in genuine investment in the local community and in local workers. And the second thing that they can do is to figure out ways, whether it's through taxation or by other means, to retain as much of the wealth that's being generated by natural gas industries and other industries, and to minimize to the greatest extent possible the damage that they do. And if that means severance taxes or other but find ways to keep more of the money that's being generated out of your resources in the local economy, get a bigger share. And that's why the message was that to them was, to county commissioners who are by and large supportive of the industry, one of the things that I would say to them is that, whether you support the gas industry or oppose it, whether you support fracking or oppose it, the fact is that you're getting a bad deal.
Yeah.
And nobody should be for a bad deal.
Exactly. Yeah. I remember you saying that.
That brings me to the Keystone Opportunity Expansion Zone program. And this is the program that exempts the cracker plant from, let me get this right here, state corporate income taxes, capital stock foreign franchise taxes, personal income taxes, state sales and use taxes, local earned income net profit taxes, business occupancy taxes, local real property taxes, local sales and use taxes, and mercantile and business privilege taxes. It's, when I look at I'm a business owner, I'm a small business owner, so, and I'm not exempt from any of this. And it really drives me crazy that we've taken this multi-billion-dollar company and we've handed them these exemptions, and somehow we think that we're going to benefit from this company. It seems, I'm not an economist. I'm just a farmer and a business owner. But this seems asinine to me. Like, it doesn't make any sense to me that anyone would think that we will come out on top when this is the deal that we've brokered with these companies.
Well, and what you're suggesting right now is backed up by the facts. There's another researcher at Orvie, a guy named Nick Messenger, who I know you know, Jill. And Nick is an economist from Ohio State, and he has looked at this issue extensively, both doing his own original research and also just the literature in the field. And yeah, unfortunately, exemptions like the ones that you're talking about are oftentimes a race or parts of a race to the bottom that yields little or no economic benefit. And, the shell cracker is a poster child for that. I know Nick recently completed work with a guy named Mark Partridge, who's the head of one of the economics departments at Ohio State, looking at exactly the dynamic you're describing, except with they have an Intel chip plant that's being built in one of the northeast suburbs of Columbus, and it's producing very similar outcomes. But yeah, there's a rich literature at this point on the irrelevance, frankly, in most cases, of those kinds of incentives. I mean, if you give them to companies, they'll happily take them for obvious reasons. But there's even significant question as to how much of difference they make in influencing where companies choose to locate.
Yeah, the recent the Amazon headquarters was kind of a very well publicized example of that race to the bottom, right? They had states basically competing with how much
Support. Yeah.
support they were going to give Amazon to.
I know my state, West Virginia, we were competing for the shell cracker. And when Pennsylvania put up $1.6 billion, that was simply a case where West Virginia is a much smaller state. We couldn't do that. We would have, by God, I guarantee we would have, but Pennsylvania just is a much larger state and a much bigger economy, and you have a state government with a much bigger budget. You could do that. West Virginia couldn't.
But what Ohio could do was invest $70 million to prepare the site for the company before they even had their final investment partner or decision. So they spent all that money, Jobs Ohio, which, their whole thing, let's create jobs, economic development in Ohio. And they spent $70 million, and it's still sitting there empty. And they're waiting indefinitely, 8 years now down the road, for PTTG to say, oh, well, yeah. And they had a supposed Dalum or something, a business partner, and they backed off. And so now, yeah, once again,
With that $70 million would have been enough to fully fund the entire Centralia model in Belmont County, Ohio.
exactly.
That it would have done it.
Well, that goes back to the opportunity costs and the idea that you can kind of argue whether or not a state should be giving tax credits or exemptions at all. But let's assume that we agree that we should be incentivizing something. The idea that you could be using that 1.6 billion that was given to Shell for something like is it Centralia? Centralia
right?
model.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and the idea that could be far more effective economically, it just is maddening to me as a taxpayer and a voter that these decisions have been made, but are continuing to be made despite the data. And it just is, I'm trying not to go to this place where I'm assuming that it's all about corruption. And
I want to bring that up. Is it? I mean, is that what's happening? I mean, we know that. I do on some level, but is that what we have to accept? It's just it's a machine. It's corrupted. And what do we do about it? I mean, hey, I want to just bring up, it's ready. There's a plan. It could be implemented in Belmont County, Ohio County. Is it Marshall County? I mean, like, if we could find a billionaire or somebody with some bucks, we could implement the Centralia model and start right now outside of government support, outside of the oil and gas, fossil fuel industry. It could be done if we could get the money, right?
Well, and Orvie is right now in the process of trying to put together private foundation funding to at least carry the model out in Ohio and Marshall counties in West Virginia. Um, and if we can get more money beyond that as well. Um, and the reason we picked those two counties, frankly, is largely because their economies almost mirror in size and in condition Centralia prior to its program. So we are trying, and because we also think that those two counties, if what we were to do there were to prove successful, or even news of it were to get out, it would have a powerful effect because, as you may know, Marshall County is the biggest coal mining county in West Virginia.
I did.
And so when you're talking about trying to do something that will get the attention of deep-pocketed funders around the country, being able to say that we were able to work with the biggest coal mining county in West Virginia to join the energy transition effort is like a pretty big feather in the cap of what we're doing and a vote for it. So it would be certainly newsworthy if we were able to make that happen. And of course, we had already made an application to the Environmental Protection Agency for funding, which we did not get. But I already have, but that application, I won, the participation of the county commissions in both Ohio and Marshall County and in the city governments in Wheeling and Moundsville. They all signed on to the effort and are co-applicants. So they are on board to do this.
Incredible. Well, one other thing on this front, like part of what I wish I could have done all along, which is just focus all my time and energy on implementing the solutions, figuring out the solutions, who knows the solutions, finding the research to figure out the solutions, and you know, that's the other part that Orvie brought. Like, we knew that's what we wanted to do and had to, wouldn't it be great? 50% of the time on fighting the problems and implementing the solutions, or 100% of the time, ideally. But where I'm going with this, we have the PTTG cracker plant site after 8 years of, trying to educate, trying to, show what's happened in Shell, expose that potential here at Shell in Beaver County plant. The site's sitting there empty. Jobs Ohio wants a cracker plant there. And so another thing we've been working on in Orvie is like, how can we come up with a plan for that? I don't know how many acres it is, but that site of land, proposed cracker plant site in Belmont County, let's find an alternative project that would uplift the community, minimize the pollution, and diversify the economy, create jobs, but in a healthier, safer way. And then, get Jobs Ohio on board because they have control of that site now. So anyway, I just wanted to say that, we've had conversations, we've brainstormed, we're strategizing, but recognizing that all those folks and everywhere who have oil and gas, petrochemical, plastic, these development plans for their region that potentially increase the health impacts and could devastate the environment in local communities. Like, if we could have a way to offer alternatives, and anyway, so Orvie helps with that too. And I don't know if you can add or want to say anything to that, but I just know that that's kind of where we have to go with all of this is exposing the truth, having the data support why these are false solutions, and then the other side is finding the solutions that we need that will work, site specific, and then working that route. Am I making sense here?
You are. And, I wish I had silver bullet for you for the site, which is, by the way, about 300 acres in round numbers. Um, but we are working on it. I know I'm working on a couple of things that I frankly can't talk about right now, but that I hope may have some relevance to figure out what to do with the property. At the same time I say that, one of the challenges that I have in dealing with mayors and county commissions and folks like that is that they tend to think in terms of specific properties or specific projects. This one thing we can develop or this one thing we can put there. And of course, like with the Centralia model is an agglomeration of literally thousands of little projects that are going on out there. And so one of the challenges that I face is trying, frankly, to get them to think a little bit outside the box. I mean, it makes sense to try to find uses, productive uses for properties, like the old Burger property in Belmont County. But at the same time, they also need to be thinking about community-wide projects and things that can be done that are not just a single employer or a single project coming in. And it's one of the areas where for Orvie, we know we have to up our game. I mean, we've got some good ideas. We've got a couple of useful models, but we need to do a better job of fleshing them out, packaging them, and figuring out how to present them to people in ways that are useful and functional. So that's where a lot of our future looking focus is right now. And in fact, just a week and a half ago, I spent a couple of days in Wheeling in meetings with Joanne Kilgour, our executive director, and Nick, who I mentioned before, and Mark Partridge, the Ohio State economist, on exactly this topic.
Yeah, I feel like culturally in the United States specifically, the Industrial Revolution was such a big part of like how we identified eventually. And in places like Detroit, you had the auto workers. In places like Pittsburgh and Youngstown, you had the steel factories. You had the railroads. You had these families like the Carnegies and the Mellons. And I think that what a lot of people are missing in their analysis is that we don't really have that economy anymore. Like the Mellons and the Carnegies lived in Pittsburgh or right outside of Pittsburgh. A lot of their wealth, and there's a lot to criticize about those folks, but a lot of what they did positive was they built museums and schools and bridges and freeways in the cities that they were operating in. The people who owned the auto factories in Detroit were from that area. And nowadays it just seems like a lot of these companies they're not headquartered in the areas that they're operating in. The people who own them are not from those areas. They're not taking that wealth and reinvesting it in those communities. And in fact, what we see a lot in energy, in natural gas, and in some of these newer industries is that a lot of them are owned by multinational hedge funds. They're not even really owned and operated by individual companies or individuals that are in the United States even. And so I think that there's this, and I think that's kind of the point I was making earlier, where it's like this artifact that we have from a bygone era that we think still will work today, but it's just a completely different landscape now.
Yeah, and what you just described is one of the reasons why, going back to part of the conversation earlier, when I was pointing out how little of the money that's generated by the fracking industry and by the petrochemical industry, for that matter, ever actually lands in local economies, because we don't have the headquarters anymore for these industries, if we ever did in the case of natural gas. There's a great example of that, by the way, just a little downriver from where you guys are. Jill, have you ever been down to the Gavin Power Plant it's down by Gallipolis?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's owned by Blackstone, one of the Oh, what kind of firms? I'm blanking on the name right now. Um, but yeah, that power plant is old, decrepit, and at some point is going to close. And because the company has no vested interest in the community as a whole, when they close, it'll be just like, well, you're from Pennsylvania, Stuart. When Homer City coal plant closed about a year ago, it'll be just somebody will turn out the lights and it'll be over. There won't be any transition plan like there was in Centralia or anything like that. It'll just be everybody go home now, you're done. And it's increasingly a problem in the region.
And what's interesting too is we were talking about narratives, and when those things happen, the blame is often put on folks like us because we're pushing at the fringes of these industries. And so the narrative is like, when that plant does close down, they'll say it's because of the environmentalists or
Yeah, environmentalists make a great scapegoat for this. But we also, if we're going to win these battles, as we did in the case of the cracker plant, as we also have to look at what are the factors that determine both whether or not these things get built, and if they're already built, how are they retired? And understand that we have to be able to speak to the sensibilities of people who actually have decision-making power, and that includes investors. And that's why, for instance, the whole, not just the Belmont County cracker, but the whole notion of a petrochemical complex never came to fruition. Ultimately, the market looked at it and said, this is just dumb.
I don't understand why they came up with the plan anyway. I mean, whose idea? I mean, why was it? I don't know. Just it's all so confusing to me. Like, because I mean, I don't know. I'm just going to stop, but I just don't understand how they. I mean, it was a pretty extensive plan, including the Mountaineer ethane storage facility. It was going to be this huge brine lake right next to all these acres. Storing it. It, it was it was a massive plan, and they sold the local officials on it. The state local politicians were all for it, and then it never manifested. It never happened. So it's just partly that's a little confusing to me. But then I wanted to make another point that this goes way back kind of in our conversation. And I just remembered you said that part of the reason they, can justify the subsidies to the Shell cracker plant was that it's a way to promote and keep using Pennsylvania, you know, fracking, right? But then can you explain how in Cadiz, Ohio, 20 minutes from here or so, they've got that massive fractionation plant, and there's the Falcon pipeline that's taking all the frack gas from here. And, it's they're fracking here, going to the fractionation plant, and then going to the Beaver County Shell cracker plant. So not all the gas came from Pennsylvania because it's coming from here too, right?
Yep. And I can't explain it. I don't know what the rationale for that is or why it's happening.
But that's why sometimes, the scope of my work has expanded not only to Pennsylvania and West Virginia and beyond, but to me, the fact that, they're fracking right out west of town, mile or so from here, and that's potentially going to the Shell cracker plant. So it's not like, you see what I mean? It affect that cracker plant's affecting me here 2 hours away.
It absolutely is. And the other, I think, moral of the story that you're telling now is that people make, even big companies that have lots of folks that they pay to analyze these things can make really stupid decisions. I mean, and the Shell cracker's probably one of those, even on its own merits, even for the shareholders of Shell. It's probably a stupid decision. We'll know over the next 10 years, depending on how that plays out. But yeah, I know for me, just growing up, and again, I was born in the mid 1950s, for God's sake. As I became, most of my career I spent in corporate America or working with major corporations. And I guess I had naively always imagined that the amount of analysis and the amount of understanding that was required to take a decision usually would increase in proportion to the significance of that decision, the amount of money involved, the amount of, and one of the most disillusioning things to me is that that often isn't the case. Even the largest of companies can take decisions sometimes that, well, and we saw it. I mean, Shell decided to build a cracker and PTT decided not to.
Right.
When you go back to when they were considering doing it, Shell wasn't that far out in front of PTT. And in fact, Shell was behind. There was going to be a cracker down in Wood County, West Virginia, down around Parkersburg, the Ascend project. That was in front of the Shell project. They decided not to do it.
Hmm.
And so you're talking about three projects of roughly $10 billion worth of investment. We've now since learned that Shell turned out to be $14 billion of investment, and three different managements came to completely different decisions.
Right.
I mean, and they're looking at the same set of facts,
Right.
but it's it's a very random thing sometimes. It really is.
One of the morals of the story for me is not just with Shell specifically and this cracker plant, but just in all of this work, is that if you really took an honest analysis of cost, so and if you looked at environmental issues, like you said that it often comes down to jobs versus the environment. But these environmental issues are genuine costs. I mean, it comes down to dollars and cents at the end of the day, as well as health issues. If you pollute a community, you increase cancer rates. That is a cost, a dollars and cents cost. So the moral of the story to me is that if you actually took an honest accounting of the true cost of these things, and you also stripped away even part of the subsidies and the gross amount of support that these industries get, there's no way that this could work.
Well, interestingly, with fracking in particular, a couple of years ago, an economist at Carnegie Mellon, a guy by the name of Nick Muller, actually studied exactly what you're talking about. He looked at the natural gas industry in northern Appalachia and calculated. He and Aaron Mayfield was a co-author of this study, and they attempted to calculate what in economists would term externalities, the externalized costs that are not embedded in the price of natural gas when it's sold by the producer to the consumer. And the figure that they came up with at the time was about $2 per million BTUs, which is an interesting number because if you check the price of natural gas today, it's right around $2, which means that by their calculation, when you compute the costs, like the ones that you were just listing, when you compute those costs, if you were to factor them into the transaction, it would basically double the cost of natural gas. And the problem, of course, is that $2 that Muller and Mayfield identified isn't paid by either the producer of the natural gas or by the purchaser of the natural gas. It's paid by the rest of us. It's paid by society because the costs are real.
Yes.
And that's another factor, by the way, that does not go into any in-plan modeling of economic impacts.
This has been a very interesting conversation.
And I knew you two would, I knew Stuart would enjoy this because, he'd be saying a little thing here, a little thing there. Like, You better talk to Sean.
The story was right. We probably did need the time. Where are we at, about 3 hours or so now?
Thank you so much, Sean. I mean, but please come back. Like, we might need you all the time. I mean, we won't keep you for 3 hours, but I can see how this would it's just I really appreciate our connection, and yeah, I really appreciate you doing this because it's really powerful, you know.
No, and I appreciate the work that you do, Jill. I mean, you're the person, you put the human face on this, and I mean, I can recite statistics from now until hell freezes over, but the reality is people on the ground, and it's when you walk up to somebody and, it was in Belmont County. What the hell is it? I can't remember his name. Um, Former county commissioner there said to me once, he said, basically, he said, his son went to Oklahoma State University to college and stayed far away. And he said, I really wish that my kid could live here, but I hope he doesn't,
Wow.
because he knew he had to find a better future someplace else. That's where the rubber hits the road. That's what really matters in this gig. And my statistics are just kind of a means of getting to that point and explaining to people why this happens and why it shouldn't have to happen. The other thing, I just, before we go, I do want to leave you guys at some point, and it may not be now, but at some point, I hope you'll circle around and start hitting the subject of the hydrogen hubs and carbon capture and what's going on there. It's a really important issue right now for the region.
Well, I'm really grateful for all of us being able to connect here today and for all the information you shared and all the support that you and Orvi has given to so many of us here on the front lines and in the grassroots organizations. And please come back and frequently. And I'm just really overwhelmed with so much gratitude for all your support. So thank you so much.